Hello everyone, and I'm going to answer a question that I've been getting asked a lot lately, or questions pertaining to it in general. That is, does my planted tank, my low light planted tank, need fertilizer? So I'm going to talk a little bit and decide if you need fertilizer in the first place, signs that you may be looking for if you need fertilizer, and if you think you do need fertilizer, some easy basic ways to do it, to fertilize your tanks. Does my low light planted tank need fertilizer? And that depends on the following. Is your water hard or soft? That plays a big part on what kind of fertilizer and how much of what kind of fertilizer you need. What kind of livestock do you keep? How much food do you feed? What do you feed? That all plays important parts in how and if you need fertilizer or not. Do you have enough light? Now, light is one of the most important parts of it all. We'll talk about that later. What kind of plants and how many do you have? That all plays a part. Just what kind of plants do you have and how many of them do you have? And we'll talk about that now. I like to look at natural planted tanks as little mini closed ecosystems. Now, when we look at planted tanks, what are the levers of control? What do we actually control? And I've boiled it down to this. Light. I feel like light is number one most important aspect of any planted tank. Low light, high light, whatever. That's the engine that makes it all go. And you have your water parameters, or you could say your nutrients in the water. And livestock. What kind of food do you need to put in there to keep what kind of critters you have in there alive, and how many plants, and how many plants and what type of plants. All of these things that we control, they all need to be in a balance. So if you have more light, then you're going to need more nutrients in your water. I actually very rarely fertilize my tanks because, for one, I already have hard water to start off with, and that takes care of most of the fertilizing needs right there. And I have shrimp, and I feed a lot. I'm basically farming shrimp and moss in my tanks. And when you combine my hard water that has a lot of the micronutrients that we need with how much I feed, which that would be what we call macronutrients, then most of my tanks really don't need any fertilizer at all, because I have lots of plants, lots of shrimp, lots of snails, and I'm throwing in lots of food, and it all ends up being in a happy balance, which is what we're after. But if you have soft water and you have a real nice display tank and you only have a few fish or a few shrimp, and you don't want to dump in whole bunches of food and have it, turn into that kind of a mess and have to deal with a whole bunch of water changes because of throwing in a whole bunch of food and running into problems with that, then you may need to fertilize your plants. So if you have hard water, that takes care of your micronutrients. Usually, not all the time, but for me, most of my micronutrients are taken care of with my hard water. And then the food and all that, as much as I feed, that takes care of all the macronutrients. And the macros being nitrate, potassium, and phosphate. So if you have soft water in a tank that you're not really putting that much food in, and your plants are yellowing or dying, just not growing at all, or you even have algae problems. Algae problems can be the biggest sign that your tank needs fertilized. Plants need all the different kinds of nutrients to grow, whereas algae is a lower form of plant life, and they can get by on just certain kinds of nutrients. So certain kinds of algae can be certain kinds of nutrient deficiencies. Another thing to keep in mind, the more light that you have, the more you're going to have to fertilize. Light sets the time, it sets the pace that things move along in our planted tanks. So if you have a whole bunch of light, your plants are going to use up the nutrients in the water a whole lot faster, because the more they grow, when they grow, they use up the nutrients. So then a tank with lower light, it's going to grow a lot slower and need a lot less fertilizer nutrients to keep the plants happy. Another factor that can play a role that I talked about a little bit earlier was how many and what type of plants you have. So if you have very fast growing plants, they're going to be using up the nutrients a lot faster than a slow growing plant would. And certain types of plants like certain kinds of nutrients. Some plants are heavy iron feeders or certain things like that. Certain plants like certain nutrients. So those are things you might want to keep track of. But for the most part, I don't keep anything crazy. I just keep your most basic low light tanks for my shrimp tanks, or my basic low light tank, or basic low light plants for my shrimp tanks. And I don't have any problems with any of that. So while I very, very rarely fertilize my tanks, there are certain instances where I do. This instance right here calls for fertilizer. This is a new tank, and I didn't set this tank up the same way as I normally do my other tanks. I set this tank up to be a nice looking tank, whereas many of my tanks are just set up optimized to breed shrimp and grow plants. My website, markshellyaquatics.com. But remember when I said how many plants you have in here? And this takes into consideration how much livestock I have in here. All I have in here is a handful. Well, they're getting to be a lot of them now, but I just put a handful of little shrimp in here. So I'm not really feeding all that much. But look at all this moss in here. Look at all these stem plants. All the moss over here, all these stem plants. And I've been waiting for these stem plants to get going. They're growing. They're just getting thick instead of growing tall like I want them to. So because I have all these plants in this great big tank and all I have is a handful of shrimp, I'm not feeding nearly enough to keep up with the nutrient needs that all these plants require. So we got to put in our fertilizer. And I'll show you how I fertilize this tank and some other options out there for fertilizing. So here are the couple ways you can fertilize your tanks. Everyone knows about aquarium co-op. It really is the easiest way to fertilize. It's just pump for every 10 gallons. Now, I went away from using this because for how many tanks I have, it's not really economically viable for as many tanks and as much water as I was fertilizing back when I was fertilizing all my tanks on a regular basis. But if you just have a tank or two, it is definitely the easiest way to go. But when you have a whole bunch of tanks like I do, it's really not totally cost effective. So I ended up going with this Nilo CG. Remember I was talking about the macro, which is the kind of fertilizers that we get from our food: nitrate, potassium, phosphate. And then these are our micros, and those are the type of minerals that are in like hard water. So let's see if we can get a good view on here. I think B's boron, C copper, Fe iron, manganese, Mg, Mn, I can't recall right now, Mo, Cn, zinc, and then we got our degrees pH or GH. Now, this particular fertilizer, if we can see it here, it's called the DIYEI liquid. So it's do it yourself, and the EI stands for estimative index. So if you have really high light and you're dosing CO2, now once you get to high light, you have to dose fertilizers and CO2. CO2 is just the most important fertilizer when you start getting into high light. But this is based off the EI estimated index method. And what that means is you're dosing macros every other day and you're dosing micros every other day. Then at the end of the week, you do at least a 50% water change, and that resets everything. Now that's for a high-tech, high-light, lots of fertilizer, lots of plant growth type situation. But in low-light planted tanks and my low-light planted shrimp tanks, I am not dosing everything every day. And they also, there's a thing, I'm not exactly sure why. I do know, I'm familiar with it. They do it every other day because they say you're not, one of the ingredients, one of the minerals ends up disrupting the intake of another one. So they say to do it every other day. I've never done that. I've always just dumped them both in at the same time. I've never gone that deep with it, and I've never had any problems with it before. Low light planted tanks, I usually dose right after my water changes. And depending on how much you do, like I said, my water is super hard. So the micros, sometimes I don't even dose the micro. Sometimes I do a little bit because you never know. I know I have super hard water, but I don't know the exact contents. So what the estimative index does, you put in all the nutrients that your plants are going to need. And then at the end of the week, you change out all the water to remove any excess nutrients, and then you dose again and you start over. So in highlight situations, you're dosing every day, and in my case, you're dosing once a week. There might be medium light where you want to dose twice a week maybe, but generally I find that once a week in my kind of tanks when I do need it for dose fertilizers is plenty. So with this, all you do is open her up. And then this is the hard part, and that is dumping it all in and getting it in the bottle. So you got all that in there, and then you need to use RO or distilled water. I have distilled water for my coffee maker, and then you just slowly dump this in until it's even with this level right here. I'm dumping some on the table. Still use this now. It helps with algae, but actually the chemical in it, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but it's called glutaldehyde or something along those lines. And it is actually a cleaning agent, a disinfectant. So I like to put just a little bit in there, and that keeps, because it takes me a long time to use this. And that keeps it from getting scummy and going bad. And you shake it up real good. And then I'll go ahead and do the micros next. So now the dosing on these is, if you try this method, I would recommend you go by what they say, but I've been doing this for so long in my tanks. I know my tanks. So I'm gonna do about that much. The macros. And so hopefully this will help this tank get established. A lot of new tanks, they needed an extra kick to get going, the plants do, because you don't have that established set of a nitrogen system, of a nitrogen cycle going. You don't have the continuous output of ammonia, nitrates. You don't have that continuously going. And so the plants struggle in their tanks because of that. And then we have a whole bunch of plants in this tank like we talked about earlier. So then there we go. I probably didn't need to dose that, but I did. That's how we do that way with the NILO-CG DIY EI dosing method in our low light plant tanks. Now I only dose once a week like this. Like in the instructions, it says to do it each one every day, but you alternate which ones you're dosing. But in this, I just dump them both in about once a week. And that is more than enough than what this 75-gallon tank needs to get it going. And then, like I said, the easiest, most convenient way is Easy Green. It works just as good as the other one. Now this bottle's really old. 2, 3 for my 29-gallon tank. And that would be good for a week. So, That is the very basics of fertilizing. Hopefully I help someone out with that information. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.